2:15 in the morning. The Strait of Hormuz. The destroyer USS Mason was already slicing through the dark water at 20 knots when the first electronic ghost flickered onto the tactical display in the Combat Information Center. It was not the sharp, clean return of a commercial tanker, or the predictable sweep of a maritime patrol aircraft. The Gulf air was thick with humidity, clinging to the steel hull like a damp shroud, and smelling of heavy salt and diesel exhaust. Inside the skin of the ship, the silence of the mid-watch was about to be shattered by a threat the crew had trained for, but never truly expected to see in such overwhelming numbers. The technician sitting at the ANSPY-1 radar console leaned forward, his face bathed in the pale blue glow of the monitor. At first, the system had tagged the contact as a flock of birds, or perhaps a localized weather phenomenon. But as the radar processed the high-resolution data, the shimmering mass began to resolve into something far more clinical and far more dangerous. It was a cloud of 200 distinct signatures, each one moving with a synchronized, mechanical precision. They had launched from the Iranian coastline near Bandar Abbas, rising like a swarm of hornets from mobile shore batteries. The technician's voice was steady, a product of 1,000 hours of simulated combat, but there was an underlying edge of urgency as he reported to the tactical action officer. He announced that the contact was a mass drone launch, bearing 085, distance 25 miles, and closing at 120 knots. The tactical action officer did not hesitate. He looked at the screen, saw the wall of red icons blooming across the display, and realized that this was not a probe or a provocation. It was a saturation attack designed to bleed the ship of its ammunition and overwhelm its processors. The order for general quarters was issued immediately. Throughout the 510 feet of the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, the electronic gong began its rhythmic, insistent pulse. The sound of boots hitting the non-skid decks echoed through the narrow passageways as 300 sailors moved to their battle stations. In the engine rooms, the gas turbine engines roared to life, providing the massive electrical load required to bring the ship's defensive systems to full combat power. The commanding officer entered the Combat Information Center 45 seconds after the first alarm. He didn't need a briefing. The main tactical display told the entire story. The swarm was now 20 miles out, splitting into 3 distinct waves, to approach the USS Mason from multiple angles. This was a classic swarm tactic, intended to find a blind spot in the radar, or force the ship to turn and expose its vulnerable broadside. The air in the windowless room was cool and dry, filtered by the ship's advanced ventilation systems, yet the tension was palpable. Every sailor knew the math of a saturation strike. Each drone was a small, low-cost platform carrying a shaped charge warhead. While a single drone might only cause superficial damage, to a destroyer of this size, 50 impacts would be catastrophic. 200 impacts would turn the USS Mason into a burning coffin of steel. On the bridge, the officer of the deck peered through the night vision optics. Even with the technology, the horizon remained a wall of black. There were no lights on the incoming drones, no radio transmissions to intercept. They were flying low, skimming just 20 meters, above the crests of the waves to hide in the sea clutter. The only sign of their approach was the electronic data, flowing into the Aegis combat system. The commanding officer gripped the edge of the command chair. He watched the range numbers count down. 18 miles, 16 miles. The ship was now a pressurized environment, sealed against chemical and biological threats, its crew dressed in fire-resistant flash gear that covered everything but their eyes. The weapon systems were energized and slaved to the radar. In the Mark 41 vertical launch system cells, the Evolved Sea Sparrow Missiles were ready for flight, their guidance systems locked onto the lead elements of the swarm. But the tactical action officer was watching the density of the formation. At 12 miles, the drones began to weave, a pre-programmed maneuver to defeat long-range missile locks. The swarm was intelligent, reacting to the ship's electronic emissions. The order was given to hold the long-range missiles for a moment. They would need every second of the ship's multi-layered defense to survive this. Far above the deck, the twin mounts of the close-in weapon system, the 20mm Gatling guns, known as the Phalanx, began their automated search routine. Their white, dome-shaped radar housings tracked back and forth, searching for anything that breached the inner 5-mile perimeter. The barrels, capable of firing 4,500 rounds per minute, were already pointed toward the eastern horizon. The crew waited. The drones were coming, and they were coming all at once. The escalation in the Strait of Hormuz had not happened overnight. For 3 months, the diplomatic channels between Washington and Tehran had been choked with static, replaced by a series of increasingly violent encounters in the narrow waters of the Persian Gulf. The United States Navy had increased its presence to 3 carrier strike groups, with the USS Gerald R. Ford patrolling the North Arabian Sea, while destroyers like the USS Mason were tasked with the high-stakes mission of escorting commercial tankers through the world's most vital energy artery. This transit was not merely a routine patrol, it was a statement of global maritime law, ensuring that 20% of the world's petroleum supply continued to flow toward the industrial hubs of Europe and Asia. The strategic importance of the strait cannot be overstated. At its narrowest point, the shipping lanes are only 2 miles wide, flanked by rugged, mountainous coastlines that provide perfect cover for mobile missile batteries and small, fast attack craft. For the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the swarm was a low-cost, high-impact solution to the problem of American naval superiority. They had spent a decade perfecting the doctrine of asymmetric warfare, believing that if they could kill just one American destroyer, the political cost would force a withdrawal from the region. Tonight, they had committed 200 Shahed-style loitering munitions to that singular goal. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Mason, the Tactical Action Officer monitored the first layer of the ship's Aegis defense. The system was designed to handle hundreds of targets simultaneously, but the sheer volume of the drone swarm was pushing the software to its limits. The ship's defensive posture was a layered cake of steel and fire. The outer layer consisted of the RIM 162 Evolved Sea Sparrow Missiles, designed to intercept targets at ranges of up to 30 miles. These were the long-reach weapons, intended to thin the herd before the drones could close the distance. At exactly 2:24 in the morning, the commanding officer gave the order to engage. The ship shuddered as the first 4 cells of the Mark 41 vertical launch system blew open. There was a sequence of muffled thumps, followed by a searing white glare that reflected off the dark water as the missiles transitioned from vertical to horizontal flight. The smell of burning solid rocket fuel, a sharp, chemical stench like ozone and burnt sulfur, seeped into the ship's intake vents before being scrubbed by the filters. The Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles streaked into the night at Mach 4, their guidance fins twitching as they received mid-course updates from the ship's AN/SPY-1 radar. 12 miles out, the first 4 missiles found their marks. On the tactical display, 4 red icons vanished in an instant, replaced by a brief shimmer of electronic noise. Each missile carried a 39-kilogram blast fragmentation warhead. When they detonated, they didn't just destroy a single drone. They created a cloud of high-velocity tungsten pellets that shredded anything within a 50-meter radius. The initial success was encouraging, but the mathematics of the engagement remained grim. 4 drones were gone, but 196 remained. The second wave of missiles launched 3 seconds later, another 4-round burst that arched into the sky. The horizon was now a grid of white smoke trails lit from below by the orange glow of the ship's engines. The sound of the launches was a rhythmic, heavy drumming that vibrated through the deck plates and into the soles of the sailors' boots. In the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was one of clinical, professional focus. There was no shouting, only the quiet murmur of status reports and the clicking of mechanical keyboards. The weapons system coordinator reported that the first wave of the swarm had increased speed to 140 knots. They were beginning to spread out, a maneuver designed to force the USS Mason to expend more missiles on individual targets rather than clusters. It was a cold calculation of attrition. Every missile the Mason fired cost $2 million, while each drone cost less than $20,000. The commanding officer watched the countdown of available missiles in the vertical launch system. He knew that once the cells were empty, they could not be reloaded at sea. If the swarm breached this layer, they would be down to the 5-inch deck gun and the close-in weapon systems. He ordered the ship to increase speed to 30 knots and begin a zigzag pattern to complicate the drone's terminal guidance. The hull of the destroyer leaned hard into the turn, the propellers churning the Gulf water into a violent, phosphorescent wake. As the range closed to 8 miles, the effectiveness of the missiles began to drop. The drones were flying so low that the radar was struggling to distinguish them from the crests of the waves. The sea state was rising, with 2-meter swells beginning to break against the bow, sending sheets of salt spray over the forward gun mount. The air outside was a chaotic mess of wind, sea, and the shrieking of high-performance engines. The second layer of defense was about to be tested. The tactical action officer announced that the lead elements of the swarm were now 6 miles out. The outer tier engagement was over. The missiles had accounted for 28 confirmed kills, a respectable number, but far from enough. 172 drones were now entering the middle tier of the USS Mason's defensive umbrella. The ship's 5-inch Mark 45 deck gun rotated toward the horizon, its long barrel elevating as the fire control computer slaved it to the incoming targets. The next phase of the battle was about to begin. The brain of the USS Mason, the Aegis combat system, was now operating at a tempo that would have been impossible for a human mind to comprehend. Inside the Combat Information Center, the AN/SPY-1 radar was pulsing at maximum power, its 4 fixed arrays scanning the horizon for the slightest movement of carbon fiber and plastic. The system was no longer just tracking, it was prioritizing. It calculated the threat level of every individual drone based on its velocity, its altitude, and its projected impact point on the ship's hull. The air in the room grew warmer as the massive computer stacks processed billions of calculations every second, the cooling fans humming with a high-pitched, mechanical whine. At a range of 8 kilometers, the middle tier of the ship's defense came alive. The forward 5-inch Mark 45 gun mount rotated with a sudden, violent jerk, its long barrel slewing toward the lead cluster of the swarm. The loading system beneath the deck clattered with the sound of heavy machinery as a 70-pound shell was rammed into the breach. Then, the first round was fired. The sound was a massive, chest-compressing boom that rattled the bridge windows and sent a visible shockwave across the surface of the water. A cloud of gray cordite smoke erupted from the muzzle, instantly swept away by the 30-knot wind of the ship's movement. Inside the mount, the automatic loader worked with a rhythmic, metallic precision, cycling a new shell every 3 seconds. These were not standard high-explosive rounds. They were programmed air-burst shells, each one fused to detonate exactly 3 meters in front of a target. The 5-inch gun barked 20 times in the span of a single minute. 6 miles away, the dark sky was punctuated by orange flashes of light. Each detonation sent a cone of white-hot steel fragments forward, shredding the fragile wings and engines of the incoming drones. 7 more red icons blinked out on the tactical display, but the remaining swarm members simply adjusted their flight paths, closing the gaps in their formation with a hive-like intelligence that was deeply unsettling to those watching the screens. As the gun continued its heavy, rhythmic pounding, the ship's electronic warfare suite, the SLQ-32, began its silent contribution to the battle. The technicians in the electronic warfare booth engaged the high-power jammers, flooding the airwaves with a wall of electromagnetic noise. They were attempting to sever the command links between the drones and their shore-based controllers, or at the very least, to blind the drones' onboard GPS receivers. For a few seconds, it seemed to work. A dozen drones began to wobble, their steady flight paths turning into erratic, drunken spirals. 3 of them collided with each other, erupting in small, gasoline-fueled fireballs that fell hissing into the sea. Another 5 veered off course, crashing into the waves miles short of their target. But the vast majority of the swarm, now numbering 154, continued their relentless advance. They had transitioned to autonomous terminal guidance, relying on simple optical sensors that were immune to radio frequency jamming. The tactical action officer reported that the swarm had reached the 5-kilometer mark. They were moving too fast and were too numerous for the 5-inch gun to handle alone. The barrel of the gun was smoking, the paint on its steel surface beginning to blister from the intense heat of 25 rapid-fire rounds. The commanding officer could feel the ship vibrating. Beneath his feet, a constant, low-frequency shudder from the engines and the weapons. The deck was littered with spent brass casings from the bridge wing machine guns, which the security teams were now charging in preparation for the final, desperate layer of defense. The sea was dark, save for the occasional flash of a distant explosion and the white, foaming crests of the waves. The smell of the ocean, once salt and spray, was now dominated by the acrid, metallic stink of burnt gunpowder and the oily residue of the ship's own exhaust. The humidity was so high that a thin film of moisture covered every horizontal surface, making the decks slick and treacherous. Inside the Combat Information Center, the lights were dimmed to a deep red to preserve the crew's night vision. Every face was tight with concentration, eyes locked on the glowing screens. The countdown until the first impact was now measured in seconds, not minutes. The tactical action officer announced that the swarm was breaking into its final attack profile, a multi-axis dive intended to hit the ship from the front, the back, and both sides simultaneously. The drones were now close enough that the low-frequency drone of their small engines could be heard. Over the roar of the ship's own wake, a sound like 1,000 angry wasps, growing louder and more insistent with every passing heartbeat. The commanding officer gripped the armrests of his chair. He gave the final authorization. Close-in weapon systems, set to fully automatic. Engage all targets within the inner kill zone, 2:31 in the morning. The dark expanse of the Strait of Hormuz was now illuminated by the dying embers of 28 drones and the periodic, blinding flashes of the 5-inch deck gun. The USS Mason was vibrating with a violent, high-frequency intensity as its 4 gas turbine engines pushed the 8,000-ton destroyer to its structural limits at 32 knots. The wake behind the ship was a churning path of white foam and bioluminescent green, stretching for a mile into the blackness of the Gulf. The air on the open bridge wings was a chaotic mix of salt spray, the hot metallic scent of the gun barrel, and the faint, sweet smell of unburned jet fuel from the falling debris. The swarm had now closed to within 4,000 meters, and the tactical display showed that the remaining 140 drones were no longer acting as a single mass, but had transitioned into their terminal attack profiles. The approach profile was a masterpiece of programmed attrition. 60 drones remained at a sea-skimming altitude of only 5 meters, their optical sensors locked onto the massive slab of the ship's hull. Another 40 had climbed rapidly to an altitude of 2,000 meters, preparing for a near-vertical terminal dive that would target the ship's sensitive radar arrays and the thin armor of the upper decks. The final 40 units were circling wide to the north and south, intended to strike the stern and the vulnerable helicopter hangar. The USS Mason was being squeezed from every conceivable angle. In the Combat Information Center, the electronic warfare officer shouted for the deployment of passive decoys. The commanding officer nodded, and the order was relayed to the launcher stations. On the port and starboard sides of the superstructure, the Mark 36 Super Rapid Bloom offboard chaff launchers fired with a series of sharp, pneumatic thuds. 24 canisters were propelled into the air, bursting 300 meters away from the ship to create a massive cloud of aluminum-coated glass fibers. To the drone's primitive radar seekers, these clouds appeared as 6 separate destroyers, momentarily confusing their targeting logic. Simultaneously, 2 Nolka-active electronic decoys were launched from their armored housings. These sophisticated, hovering rockets rose on a pillar of white flame, positioned themselves several hundred meters away from the hull, and began to broadcast a simulated radar return that was significantly larger and more tempting than the USS Mason itself. For 30 seconds, the tactic worked. 12 drones from the high-altitude group veered away from the ship, diving at terminal velocity into the empty ocean, where the electronic ghosts of the Nolka decoys hovered. They impacted the water with massive plumes of white spray, their gasoline engines screaming until the moment of contact. Despite the decoys, over 100 drones remained committed to the kill. They were now within 3,000 meters, less than 60 seconds from impact. The bridge watchstanders could finally see them through their thermal optics, small, winged shapes glowing bright white against the cold background of the night sky. They looked like a migration of ghost birds, silent and relentless. The sound of their engines had unified into a singular, low-frequency throb that seemed to vibrate the very air inside the sailors' lungs. The tactical action officer reported that the ship's soft kill measures had reached their maximum effectiveness. The chaff clouds were drifting downwind, and the Nulka decoys had exhausted their flight time. The swarm was now too close for electronic trickery. This was the moment where the ship's physical armor and its fastest-firing guns would have to stand alone. The air in the Combat Information Center was freezing from the air conditioning, yet every sailor's flash gear was damp with sweat. On the forward deck, the 5-inch gun finally fell silent, its barrel glowing a dull, angry red in the darkness. The automatic loader had reached the end of its ready service magazine, and the weapon system was now entering a mandatory cooling cycle. The defense of the ship now rested entirely on the two close-in weapon systems, the Phalanx mounts, located forward and aft. These white, dome-shaped units were already slewing with mechanical ferocity, their internal radars locked onto the nearest threats. The commanding officer looked at the master engagement screen. The outer circles were gone. The middle circles were gone. The red icons of the drone swarm were now touching the innermost circle of the display. The zone measured in hundreds of meters rather than miles. He could feel the ship leaning as the helmsman executed a hard overturn to the starboard, trying to present the smallest possible profile to the incoming wave. The deck was slick, the wind was howling, and the first of the drones was now only 1,500 meters away. The 90-second shield was about to be activated, 2:32 in the morning. The innermost defensive perimeter of the USS Mason was no longer a theoretical line on a digital display. It was a physical reality, measured by the closing distance of 138 incoming suicide drones. The ship's master combat computer had already exhausted the optimal firing windows for the medium-range missiles. Now, the engagement had shifted into the final, high-intensity phase of the defense. The air around the destroyer was a thick, humid soup of sea spray and the lingering, acrid smell of missile exhaust. The vibration from the 4 gas turbine engines had reached a bone-deep resonance as the ship fought to maintain 33 knots in the rising swells of the Persian Gulf. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer watched the proximity data. The lead drone was now only 1,200 meters from the port bow, traveling at nearly 200 kilometers per hour. The ship's passive electronic measures had managed to confuse several targets, but the sheer volume of the swarm meant that dozens were still locked onto the ship's radar cross-section. The commanding officer tightened his grip on the command chair, his knuckles white under his fire-resistant gloves. He gave the order to release the final 2 Evolved Sea Sparrow Missiles in a point-blank intercept. The vertical launch system cells erupted for the last time. The 2 missiles tore out of the deck with a thunderous roar, their solid rocket boosters painting the ship's superstructure in a momentary, hellish orange light. They transitioned almost instantly, detonating less than 1,000 meters from the hull. 2 massive fireballs bloomed in the darkness, and the shock waves slammed into the side of the bridge with the force of a physical blow. 5 more drones were instantly vaporized by the tungsten fragments, their debris falling into the churning wake of the ship. But even as the fire from the missiles faded, the remaining drones pressed the attack. They had breached the middle tier. They were now in the terminal dive, their small optical sensors tracking the heat signatures of the ship's exhaust stacks. The sound of their small, high-revving engines was now a constant, terrifying scream that cut through the wind. The forward close-in weapon system mount, the 20mm Phalanx Gatling gun, surged to life in its fully automatic mode. The trigger was squeezed by the internal computer logic. The gun shrieked into the night, a 3-second burst that sent a white column of fire punching toward the lead contact. The heat blast from the muzzle washed across the faces of the bridge lookouts, and the white-hot tracers carved a brilliant line through the humid salt air. The smoke rose in a dense, swirling cloud that momentarily blotted out the portside horizon. The stream of tungsten alloy rounds punched clean through the carbon fiber fuselage of the lead drone, detonating the explosive payload inside. The drone erupted instantly, the fuel cell and warhead combining to create a 6-meter ball of expanding fire. The engine block, a white-hot piece of mangled steel, was sent flying upward another 10 meters before it tumbled back toward the water. The shockwave of the detonation was so close that it shattered one of the ship's external floodlights, sending glass raining down onto the deck. The following drones reacted with a programmed mechanical panic. 3 of them wrenched their flight paths hard to the left, trying to evade the wall of fire, but the ship's radar slaved the Gatling gun to their new trajectories with flawless precision. The lead drone of the second wave came apart in a single white flash, its wings severed by the stream of shells, debris scattered across a mile of open water, the burning remnants of the aircraft hissing as they hit the sea surface. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of chaos and light. Black smoke rose from the wreckage, settling into the sea, while the sky was still torn by the orange streaks of the remaining drones. The burning pieces were still above the water when the radio channels of the ship's internal communication system erupted in overlapping reports from the damage control teams. Every sailor on the ship could feel the heat radiating from the forward gun mount. The battle was far from over. 121 drones were still airborne, and they were now converging on the USS Mason from 3 different bearings. The close-in weapon system mount was already slewing toward the next target, its barrels spinning at a blurring speed. The 90-second shield was being tested to its absolute breaking point, and the deck of the destroyer was about to become the most dangerous place in the Persian Gulf. 2:33 in the morning. The tactical situation inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Mason had transitioned from a controlled engagement into a desperate struggle against mathematical saturation. The remaining 121 drones were no longer acting as independent units. They had synchronized into a 3-dimensional attack geometry, designed to overwhelm the ship's radar processing capacity. The air in the windowless command center was now heavy with the smell of scorched electronics and the ozone-laden scent of ionized air from the massive power draw. Outside, the Gulf was a churning cauldron of black water and white foam, reflecting the orange flickers of distant explosions that continued to dot the eastern horizon. The swarm's new tactic was a coordinated blinding maneuver. 30 of the drones had climbed to an altitude of 3,000 meters, positioning themselves directly above the destroyer's radar arrays. They began a high-velocity, 70-degree dive, aiming not for the waterline, but for the phased array faces of the AN/SPY-1 radar system itself. If even one of these drones impacted the superstructure, the ship would be blinded, turning the multi-billion-dollar destroyer into a helpless target. For the remaining 91 loitering munitions, the tactical action officer reported that the computer was struggling to maintain solid tracks on the diving targets, while simultaneously managing the sea skimmers approaching from the beam. The ship's primary defense against this vertical threat was the aft close-in weapon system, a 20mm Gatling gun capable of firing 75 rounds every single second. The mount slewed vertically with a violent, mechanical snap, its radar dome tracking the lead diver at a range of 2,000 meters. The gun erupted with a sound like a giant piece of canvas being torn in half, sending a continuous stream of white-hot tungsten tracers into the dark sky. The heat from the rapid-fire barrel was so intense that the air above the aft deck began to shimmer, distorting the stars that hung low over the Iranian coastline. The lead diver was struck at a range of 800 meters. The tungsten rounds shredded the drone's composite wings, causing it to tumble wildly before the gasoline-soaked engine ignited in a brilliant purple flash. 2 more drones in the same diving column were caught in the follow-up burst, their frames disintegrating into thousands of pieces of burning carbon fiber. Despite these kills, the sheer density of the incoming fire was reaching the saturation point of the ship's automated response systems. The computer was now forced to switch targets every 2 seconds, leaving less and less time to confirm the destruction of each individual threat. Below the waterline, the sonar technicians could hear the muffled thuds of the debris hitting the surface of the sea, a constant rain of metal and plastic against the hull. The ship was now executing a series of violent, high-speed maneuvers at 34 knots, the propellers cavitating and creating a roar that vibrated through every deck plate. The executive officer monitored the fuel consumption and engine temperatures, noting that the gas turbines were operating at 105% of their rated power. Every system on the USS Mason was being pushed into the red zone, held together by the discipline of the crew and the precision of American engineering. The tactical action officer announced that the middle-tier defense was officially exhausted. The 5-inch gun had been forced into an emergency cooling cycle, and the last of the vertical launch cells were empty. The swarm had successfully drained the ship's primary magazines, and now the remaining 85 drones were closing in for the final kill. They were only 2 kilometers away, moving in a tight, overlapping formation that looked like a solid wall of shadows on the night vision optics. The humidity outside had become a tactical factor, as the salt-laden air began to coat the optical sensors of the close-in weapon systems, requiring the deck teams to use emergency washdown cycles. The commanding officer stood in the center of the bridge, his eyes fixed on the forward horizon. He could now see the individual strobe lights of the drones with his naked eyes, tiny flickering points of white light against the black sky. The sound was no longer a distant hum, it was a physical pressure, a high-pitched mechanical scream that drowned out the sound of the wind. He knew that the next 90 seconds would determine the fate of his ship and the 300 sailors under his command. The inner-tier defense was the only thing left between the USS Mason and a catastrophic series of impacts. The bridge wing machine gunners, armed with 50 caliber heavy machine guns, were now given the order to fire at will. The heavy thud-thud-thud of the machine guns added a new, lower frequency to the cacophony of the battle, the massive brass casings clattering onto the deck plates in a steady rhythm. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and salt, a suffocating mixture that burned the throats of the sailors standing in the open air. The first of the sea skimmers was now only 1,000 meters from the port side, its seeker head locked onto the massive heat signature of the ship's engine rooms. The final transition to the 90-second shield was complete. 2:34 in the morning. The final distance was measured in hundreds of meters, not miles. The remaining 85 drones of the Iranian swarm had reached the absolute inner limit of the USS Mason's defensive umbrella. They were closing at a combined velocity of nearly 60 meters per second, a wall of mechanical death that filled every quadrant of the ship's tactical displays. The air was a vibrating pressure of screaming engines, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of the 50 caliber machine guns on the bridge wings. The smell of the sea had been completely replaced, in the searing heat of multiple gas turbines running at maximum capacity. The forward and aft close-in weapon system mounts were now the only thing standing between the destroyer and total destruction. The computer-controlled Gatling guns shifted into their most aggressive engagement mode, known as Auto Special. The forward Phalanx mount locked onto the lead sea skimmer at a range of 800 meters. The trigger was squeezed. By the internal logic of the fire control computer, the 20mm gun shrieked into life, a solid, white-hot stream of fire, punching forward from the spinning barrels. The sound was a continuous, deafening roar that cracked eardrums and vibrated through the very marrow of the sailors' bones. A 3-second burst sent 225 tungsten sub-projectiles into the dark sky, creating a wall of metal at a range of 500 meters. The tungsten rounds punched straight through the light carbon fiber fuselages, shredding the engines and detonating the high-explosive warheads in a rapid-fire sequence of orange eruptions. The impact was so violent that the drones were not merely shot down, they were obliterated into thousands of molten fragments. A fireball from the lead drone bloomed instantly, the heat blast washing across the forward deck and bleaching the gray paint of the ship's hull. The temperature in the center of the detonation reached 3,000 degrees, and the shockwave sent a spray of burning gasoline across the surface of the sea. The swarm reacted with a desperate, programmed maneuver to overwhelm the aft mount. 40 drones executed a simultaneous terminal dive from 3 different directions, trying to find a gap in the radar's coverage, but the aft close-in weapon system was faster than any human operator could ever be. It slewed 180 degrees in less than half a second, its barrels already spinning at 4,500 rounds per minute. The gun drove into the heart of the diving formation, its tracers carving a brilliant, lethal arc through the salt spray. One drone was severed in half, its wings falling away as the fuselage tumbled into the wake of the ship. Another was crushed by the sheer kinetic energy of the tungsten rounds, spinning wildly before it slammed into the water only 50 meters from the starboard side. The immediate aftermath of the 90-second engagement was a landscape of hellish light and sudden, deafening silence. The sky, which had been filled with the flickering lights of the swarm, was now empty of any moving contacts. Black smoke rose in thick, oily columns from the wreckage still settling into the Gulf, and the surface was littered with burning debris for as far as the thermal optics could see. The sound of the guns had stopped, leaving rhythmic splashing of the sea against the hull. The forward gun mount was smoking, its white dome covered in a layer of black soot and the barrels glowing a dull, angry red in the darkness. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer stared at the main display. The cloud of red icons that had threatened to swallow the ship was gone. The screen showed exactly 0 hostile contacts within the 20-mile radius. The silence in the room was absolute for 3 full seconds, broken only by the heavy breathing of the radar operators. Then, the voice of the commanding officer came over the internal circuit, steady and professional, but with an unmistakable edge of relief. He announced that the swarm had been neutralized and ordered all stations to provide immediate damage and ammunition reports. The 90-second shield had held, but the cost was visible in every glowing piece of scrap metal bobbing in the ship's wake. The deck of the USS Mason was a graveyard of expended brass. Thousands of empty shell casings covered the non-skid surface, rolling back and forth with every heave of the ship in the 2-meter swells. The air was still thick with the chemical bite of burning propellant, a smell that would linger in the sailors' flash gear for days. They had survived the largest drone saturation attack in naval history, but the reality of what had just happened was only beginning to sink in. The battle was over, but the work of securing the ship and preparing for the next potential wave was just beginning. 2:36 in the morning, the Gulf of Oman. The destroyer, USS Mason, was a silhouette of jagged steel against a horizon still flickering with the orange funeral pyres of 200 drones. The immediate threat had vanished from the radar screens, but the ship was now entering a phase of the operation that was just as critical as the combat itself. The air was thick with the heavy, cloying scent of burnt tungsten, hydraulic fluid, and the salt-cracked dry heat of the gas turbine exhaust. On the decks, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic metallic clank of cooling gun barrels and the sloshing of seawater through the scuppers. The commanding officer ordered a full battle damage assessment and a complete inventory of the ship's remaining magazines. Damage control teams, dressed in their bulky blue flash gear and carrying thermal imaging cameras, began a systematic sweep of the upper decks and the superstructure. They moved with professional haste, checking for hull penetrations from falling debris or secondary fires caused by the intense heat of the close-in weapon system's prolonged fire. The report came back quickly. The ship had suffered no major structural damage, but the external systems had been pushed to their absolute thermal limits. The logistics of the engagement were staggering. In less than 15 minutes of active combat, the USS Mason had expended 32 Evolved Sea Sparrow Missiles and 45 5-inch shells. The most significant expenditure, however, was in the close-in weapon systems. The forward and aft Phalanx mounts had fired a combined total of 6,750 rounds of 20mm tungsten ammunition. Each mount's drum, which held 1,500 rounds, was now nearly empty, and the barrels showed signs of significant rifling wear from the sustained high rate of fire. The ship was, for all tactical purposes, nearly out of short-range defensive ammunition. In the Mark 41 vertical launch system, the situation was equally critical. Of the 96 missile cells available, 48 were now empty. While the ship still carried Tomahawk cruise missiles for land attack missions, its primary air defense capacity had been reduced by half. The commanding officer knew that a second swarm of equal size would find the ship's defenses significantly degraded. The USS Mason was now Winchester on its most effective short-range interceptors, and the replenishment of these assets was the mission's new priority. The technical teams focused on the ANSPY-1 radar arrays. The intense heat and the vibration of the ship's high-speed maneuvers had caused several calibration errors in the beam-forming computers. Technicians in the radar room worked to reset the cooling loops, which were struggling to dissipate the heat generated by the radar's maximum power search mode. Outside, the salt spray had combined with the soot from the gun muzzles to form a crust on the radar faces. Sailors were dispatched with fresh water and non-abrasive cloths to manually clean the arrays, a dangerous task on a deck still slick with the oil of expended casings. Logistics support was already being coordinated with the 5th Fleet Command in Bahrain. The USNS Supply, a fast combat support ship, was already steaming at 25 knots to rendezvous with the Mason at a point 100 miles south of the strait. The replenishment at sea, or UNREP, would be a high-stakes maneuver conducted in the middle of a contested waterway. Lines would be fired between the two ships as they moved in parallel, only 40 meters apart, to transfer thousands of pounds of ammunition and thousands of gallons of fuel. One miscalculation in the 4-meter swells would result in a collision that could do more damage than the drones ever could. The crew was exhausted, their faces pale and eyes sunken. After 72 hours of modified battle stations, the executive officer ordered a rotating schedule of rest, ensuring that half the crew remained at their stations while the others took 4-hour shifts of sleep. In the galley, the culinary specialists were preparing high-protein meals to replace the energy spent during the frantic minutes of the engagement. The smell of coffee and cooked eggs began to drift through the passageways, providing a small human comfort in the middle of a war zone. The medical team reported only minor injuries, 2 sailors with flash burns from the bridge wing machine guns, and 1 technician with a broken wrist sustained during a hard overturn. They were treated in the ship's sickbay, their names recorded for the after-action report that would eventually find its way to the Pentagon. The USS Mason was wounded but functional, a testament to the durability of the Arleigh Burke-class design and the relentless maintenance of its crew. By 3:30 in the morning, the deck had been cleared of the thousands of spent brass casings, which were crated and moved to the lower holds for recycling. The ship's engines were throttled back to a more sustainable 15 knots to conserve fuel. The commanding officer stood on the bridge, watching the first hints of a gray dawn begin to touch the eastern horizon over the mountains of Iran. The immediate crisis had passed, but the strategic landscape of the Gulf had changed forever. 5 in the morning. The Gulf of Oman, 60 miles south of the Strait of Hormuz. The sun began to crest the horizon, casting a long, golden light over the steel-gray hull of the USS Mason as it maintained a steady 15 knots. The water was a deep, tranquil blue, showing no traces of the fire and debris that had dominated the area only 3 hours earlier. The morning air was cool and crisp, a brief reprieve from the suffocating humidity of the night, and the only sound was the low, powerful hum of the gas turbine engines. The destroyer had survived the most concentrated drone saturation attack in the history of naval warfare, and the results were now being codified into a formal report for the United States Navy's Central Command. The final tally of the engagement was a testament to the effectiveness of the Aegis combat system and the discipline of the crew. Of the 200 drones launched from the Iranian coast, exactly 200 were confirmed destroyed. The defense had been executed in 3 distinct layers, culminating in the 90-second window where the close-in weapon systems annihilated the final 60 targets. The USS Mason had expended 32 Evolved Sea Sparrow Missiles, 45 rounds of 5-inch ammunition, and nearly 7,000 rounds of 20mm tungsten projectiles. The cost of the defense was estimated at $85 million, while the cost of the attacking swarm was less than $4 million. Despite the lopsided economic ratio, the strategic victory belonged entirely to the United States. The USS Mason had suffered only superficial heat damage to its forward superstructure and minor sensor calibration issues, all of which were being repaired at sea. Not a single sailor had been killed or seriously injured. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps had committed a massive portion of its regional drone inventory to a single operation and had failed to achieve even a single kinetic impact. The message sent to the present region was clear. The United States Navy possessed the technology and the will to keep the global shipping lanes open, regardless of the scale of the threat. By 6 in the morning, the USS Mason made visual contact with the USNS Supply and its escort, the cruiser CG-73. The replenishment at sea began immediately, with heavy fuel lines and ammunition pallets being transferred across the narrow gap between the ships. The crew worked with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, loading fresh canisters of missiles into the vertical launch system cells and refilling the drums of the close-in weapon systems. The ship would be back to full combat readiness within 4 hours, prepared to resume its escort duties in the strait. The regional response to the engagement was swift and decisive. The Pentagon ordered the immediate deployment of an additional carrier strike group led by the USS Abraham Lincoln to the North Arabian Sea. 2 additional Arleigh Burke-class destroyers were ADS-SSAMI, diverted from the Mediterranean to reinforce the Fifth Fleet's presence in the Persian Gulf. The United States Department of State issued a formal warning, backed by the evidence of the recovered drone wreckage, stating that any further interference with commercial shipping would be met with a proportional kinetic response against shore-based infrastructure. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Mason, the atmosphere had returned to the quiet, professional hum of a routine watch. The red lighting had been switched back to standard white, and the smell of fresh coffee had finally replaced the acrid scent of cordite. The technicians at the radar consoles continued to scan the horizon, their eyes tracking the hundreds of commercial vessels that were now resuming their transit through the strait. The bridge lookouts, though exhausted, remained vigilant, their binoculars sweeping the dock coastline for any signs of renewed activity. The commanding officer sat in his chair on the bridge, a handwritten letter to the crew resting in his lap. He intended to read it over the ship's general announcing system once the replenishment was complete. He would tell them that they had done what they were trained to do, and they had done it better than anyone thought possible. He would remind them that while the technology was impressive, it was the sailors, the technicians, the gunners, the engineers, and the lookouts who had saved the ship. The USS Mason was more than a collection of sensors and weapons. It was a living embodiment of American resolve. As the morning sun climbed higher into the sky, the destroyer completed its turn, heading back toward the narrow neck of the Strait of Hormuz. The 90-second shield had held, and the path remained open. The shadow of the ship stretched out across the water, a long, dark line of steel that seemed to claim the Gulf as its own. The battle was over, the summary was written, and the mission continued.